Welcome back. In Chapter 2, Catherine lays out her two major goals. The first is to challenge party faithfuls to examine whether their party's policies are supporting a truly conservative or liberal agenda. When I read that she wanted faithful believers to examine anything, a song by Zach Paxson came to mind.
Good luck with that. Let me know how it works out. I'll be thinking about you when I'm watching the game on Sunday.
Like Catherine, I'm all about challenging faithful believers in both parties to examine the rot at the core of the corporation doing business as a political party that they're a faithful member of. It seems to me that probably 2/3 of the loyal members of both parties are going to be unwilling to even question, much less examine, the wonderfulness of their party. Still, if even just 1/3 of them did do that and then quit and joined us in the WTF majority, I suck at math, but I think it's likely that we could become an actual majority and we could elect independent candidates who don't suck. Catherine's second goal is to demonstrate to what degree both parties have abandoned American interests in favor of a single global agenda, one that is devastating our citizens, threatening our national security, and corrupting our constitutional government. I don't know, but it seems to me that by 2011, when this book came out, pretty near 100% of well-informed members of the WTF majority already knew that. By 2016, probably every Trump supporter Republican knew that. The problem is, probably 100% of faithful Democratic Party believers are blissfully unaware. So we should try to help them to be better informed. Unfortunately, probably none of them will be watching this video series. And so Catherine and I will be pretty much preaching to the choir as she gets into that. Catherine goes on for several pages talking about the two parties' original principles and how they morphed into what they are today. Most of us boomers were born when a true American conservative Republican was president, Dwight Eisenhower. We lived through the Republican Party morphing into the Edmund Burke-style abomination it is today. Catherine makes a very important point when she says that what was considered mainstream Republican politics in the 1970s is now labeled far left or socialist by modern conservatives. As I pointed out before, if you are not a devout believer in Edmund Burke's rich elitist a-hole conservative ideology, you are auto-freaking-matically considered a socialist by them. You got to remember, psychology, true fact. If you are not a devout believer in any cult-like ideology, you are automatically branded the enemy by them. There is never any middle ground. To these Edmund Burke type conservatives, their public position is that they love democracy, but what they actually practice is corporatocracy, as I pointed out before. Though they may preach capitalism, what they actually practice is called corporatism, which we're going to cover in a couple chapters. Though they may preach patriotism, what they actually practice is partisanship. Though they may preach that they love Jesus, what they actually practice is an Old Testament-based ideology justifying their vainglorious pride and their worship of the almighty dollar. Next, Catherine looks at the Democratic Party, saying how Bill Clinton's strategy of triangulation, of adopting Republican Party policies pushed the Democratic Party to the right. She points out how he befriended Wall Street and tech sector billionaires and put a lot of Wall Street investment bankers in his administration as economic advisors. She says, by the end of Clinton's second term, the line on economic issues between the parties had blurred considerably. A lot of nerds point out how by the end of Clinton's second term, the Democratic Party had essentially become a pro-choice, pro-LGBT, anti-gun Republican Party. Catherine continues her analysis of the two parties right up through Obama, who was president when she wrote this. It no doubt got some liberal panties in a bunch when she said, if you look at his actions thus far, Obama is not so different from George W. Bush in several respects. Then she goes on for more than a page listing those several ways that Obama was pretty much just like Bush and earlier Republicans. I counted 17 specific ways. She goes on to say, the point here is that both national parties have abandoned any consistent ideology. Their interests are more closely aligned with their pocketbooks. I should point out that a lot of nerds would argue that the two parties do in fact have a consistent ideology. Essentially that Edmund Burke rich elitist a-hole ideology. Nerds would call elites like that on the right neocons, neoconservatives, and the more socially liberal elites like that on the left, neolibs, neoliberals. I would argue that there are a lot of elites on the right who are every bit as pro-abortion, pro-LGBT rights as your average liberal. And they just lie about it to fool their base. Which kind of makes Catherine's next point for her when she says, both sides rely on our willingness to rally around meaningless catchphrases and talking points and pray we won't examine either their records or their real allegiances. Catherine goes on to talk about how both parties are basically so disgusting that independent voters, who, by the way, decide most elections, both parties are so disgusting that independent voters swing back and forth trying to find honest, competent leadership. She says there's a real danger that this silent majority, what I call the WTF majority, will give up on politics entirely, handing over our democracy to powerful special interests. Seems to me that has already happened, despite the fact that corporate media proclaimed the 2020 election a triumph for democracy because a historically significant 2/3 of eligible voters voted in 2020. If you look at the polling data, roughly half of the people who voted Democrat and roughly 1/3 of the people who voted Republican voted not for a candidate that they liked, trusted, or believed in, but instead voted for the lesser of two evils. If you add that to the roughly 1/3 of eligible voters who didn't vote at all, including me, that's basically a majority of Americans who have given up on the system. Catherine sums it up toward the end of the chapter, saying that neither party offers an antidote to the political hell we're in, because that would return much of their power to the American people, where it belongs. Then she quotes George Washington, because you were probably never taught this in school. George Washington sternly warned against political parties, calling them potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men would be able to undermine the power of the people and take for themselves the reins of government. He said parties were destructive of liberty, stirring up hatred and occasionally riot and insurrection. I think the father of our country has a few words for you. Next, Catherine lists a few things that we need. First of all, we need tough, independent-minded Americans demanding the truth. Lord knows you ain't going to get that from the vast majority of politicians or their propaganda whores in corporate media. Second, we need leaders who offer real ideas rather than meaningless attacks. A lot of lefty libs would say, well, Bernie Sanders has real ideas. Yeah, real socialist ideas. If any lefty libs watch this video series, please, for God's sake, pull your heads out of your asses, climb down off of your high horses, come down out of your academic ivory towers, and talk with us real American conservatives. Okay, some of us may be a little rough around the edges, but I guarantee you, we ain't as bad as your liberal media has brainwashed you into believing we are. Most importantly, you would find that we have a lot of common ground. Third, we need to rediscover the sense of national will that has defined our greatest moments, leading not by force, but by example. Reading that reminded me of my favorite line from the movie Apollo 13.
I know what the problems are, Henry. This could be the worst disaster NASA's ever experienced.
With all due respect, sir, I believe this is going to be our finest hour.
I would add a fourth thing we need. It might be funny watching monkeys in a zoo throwing poop at each other, but watching grown men and women, Americans, do essentially the same thing, that ain't funny. That's why, to me, the wisdom of a man named Paul to the Corinthians would seem to help. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, understood as a child, reasoned as a child. But when I became a man, I gave up those childish ways. Catherine ends off chapter 2 with a quote from John Adams, who said, "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Catherine ends off saying, I hope we prove him wrong. So do I, which is why I'm doing this video series. We the people and the Lord above, that's pretty much all we got. These politicians in both parties are basically there to serve themselves and their parties, not us. Next time I'll cover chapter 3, entitled True American Capitalism. Lefty lib socialists believe they already know it all when it comes to capitalism, so there's no reason why they would want to watch. Anybody else might find it interesting. Might even learn something. Hope you join me. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.